당은 그지 아나 돈이 동반이 발신 주게 있는데 셔리야 발신님네 이거 쉬어야야다 는 그지 동반이 또 그비 김제로 시다 디고 마시에 되든마 다데 델야 안에 발소리 동반이 또 별로디 안에 거기에 자와 봉와 님보 자와 돈이 또 비시라레스 델야는 이월 파치셔야 되는 donam topiki tonyu tubi shirab siyata, kunzub tenpa topiki ne shirab siyata. Tene simjiki tuyenje pa topi shirasi sumyu. Ne kasanga zudi donam topi shirab diyo korma kisin shiya sarwa.
Good evening. So last week we started to look at the sixth of the six perfections, namely the perfection of wisdom. And it's the perfection of wisdom that one trains one's mind in order to gain realization of emptiness. Because emptiness, or the wisdom that realizes emptiness, is the antidote to all suffering, is the actual antidote to all suffering. And last week we looked at the first of the three divisions of the perfection of wisdom. And those divisions again are the wisdom that knows the ultimate, the wisdom that knows the conventional, and the wisdom that knows how to accomplish the welfare of sentient beings.
nyomoba leda nyomoba letne gigore deda leda nyomobe gi tsawa de ya dasin ma denzi marik pasya de res san denzi marik ba de letne gigore san jogi denzi marik ba de mewa ma so ba ina ne khowal pa thu ma res khowal tharba da thamji kin be ko ma thu ma de denza denzi marik pasya de mewa pang ko res di pang ba la tong yu tu be shira kom je pan ma do ane she lo lam kar kom ba ina tong yu tu be shira ma kom ba ina ane dinzi mari pasaya de mewa su tugo mares dinza azuge di mewa su go wenza ane dinzi tongba ni do ne tong yu kom ge kim zero di re sa chi di sherang.
Last week when we were looking at the first division, the wisdom that knows the ultimate, I discussed how all the suffering that we experience comes about in dependence on the contaminated karma that we've accumulated, and that comes about in dependence on our afflicted minds. And all our afflicted minds have as their root cause the ignorance of self-grasping. So there's this process that due to the afflictions that arise from our ignorance of self-grasping, contaminated karma is accumulated, and this, as it ripens, continues to keep us bound in the suffering realms of samsara. And in order to gain freedom from the suffering realms of samsara, one has to sever the root cause of our remaining bound in these suffering states. And that is the root cause, again, is that ignorance of self-grasping. And this root cause has as its direct antidote the wisdom realizing emptiness. And it's only cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness that the root cause of all our suffering can be severed, and thereby liberation from suffering can be attained. Hence the need to train in the wisdom that realizes emptiness.
지나당 한쪽에 다시 말이 받자와 인비기 김세를 계신 한쪽에 쉬마다 오마주바나리아 안에 가르스네 담봉하셔 달라 신주제 다기 디시원라 차게 봐서 좀 맞으면 지상하고 삼마 카르게 ben다 담봉하 세베 삼는 주고 그래서 지상하 세베 삼는 코를 쳐게 제라 되네 네 잘라 아니 네 수보 아니 네 자오 사당 안데네게 안치기 레용으로 되네 되네자 안델양 네 세딩이 녀다 네 잘라다 진짜 안데네 레요데 되네 열라 될이야 차버지야나 되네 네 자오 지세기여도 되네 삼는 딜레를 된 파셔들 막아비게 컨트롤해야나 진짜 되네 온게는 저기 차단요 모세 딜레용으레스 진짜 니네 자다 네 수보 네 연대 세계도 되네기 전에 나게 소수교 수보다 소수교 연대라 연대 민한지 작바기야다 샤라 통초 따는 나게야라 소바디 용거를 진짜 녀모 받쳐서 당보가 세베 삼도 코 디제라 네 셋레어도 두스체나는 녀모 받기 기고래 세지 가서 먼저 디고 쉬 사실와
Last week I also presented a verse from Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, or entry into the Middle Way. And this was the verse from the very first chapter, which went, I don't have it with me, so it went something like, so when something along the lines of, okay, so through initially through initially clinging at a self and I, arises attachment for things which are mine. So these were the first two lines, and these were from the fourth verse, or the third verse, from the first chapter of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way. And here he's stating explicitly that first, from clinging to a sense of I, from a clinging to a self or an I, arises mine. So the things that one therefore considers one's own. So through having the sense of I and grasping at it, this ignorance of self-grasping, together with this comes the sense of mine. So we'll have my loved ones, my friends, and thereafter having the sense from the sense of I, grasping at things as being mine, the other afflictions follow: attachment to our loved ones, anger towards our enemies. And similarly, in relation to ourselves, we'll think of my body. So there's a sense of I, and then we relate to the mind of my body. Then independence on our body, on the sense of feeling my body, attachment may arise. Or if you think of mental good qualities, pride in these mental qualities may arise. So from the sense of I comes the sense of self, from the grasping at a self comes the grasping at mine. And from this then, the root cause of the ignorance of self-grasping follow the other afflictions, such as attachment, anger, pride, jealousy, and so forth.
지사 당하는 저기 당하는 rakpa 되게 삼는 거 하고 당번 가서 갈래가 제베나 당번 나 세베 삼들 리그로 당하서 리기도 하대 네 자다 변하는 저기 롭션으로 제베나 맞을 저기 레가로 제나 나 세 당번 삼다 당 나래야 디고도 지사 네 디체고도 센데네 네 수볼야 요야기 둘로 고도 네 수볼 칼라사야 고도 시비기 내가 소소 수부 손급제야다 데네도 고도 세야 돼 내가 가래 제베 당번 나 세베 삼는 거 디 터네는 저기 레가지 말이야 디고도 네 디체고스베 지네 내용을 데네 레어도 레가 제어도 되네 다와 튠바다 마튠비 괜찮네 다와 마튠네 데네 데레야 안 지가 저기 코르기야다 녀모바기야 니원게 안디시야다 안지가 아직 베네 셈젠다 데네게 지금 총다 변조를 착백이 지는 생활을 디고스비 데네 디 탑시야야 셈제 소주지 시야가 종야라 소바다 데네게 토냐가지 지리야데 이제 니가도 디버사야 되게 되네 용거라 개와사베네다 아주 벤다보 나세베 삼니고 오든가 지게 최지체오든가 곰지켜고 나 세딩 나 삼는 코르친 되네 신이가지고 곰자래 아니 아주 쉬쉬야래 지게 디봉게르치야 되네 삼지 다보 나세데 리거로 차산 데네 락바락바 삼다는 아주 다보 나세 삼다 되네 나 이디치하고 삼는 리기여 바딩 아주
It's imperative that we who aspire to come to realize emptiness start here at this beginning point with gaining a feel for how we have the sense of I that we grasp at, and from this follows the thought of mine. And this, if we look carefully, in any situation, we can find it. There is almost always a sense of I. And when we come, and we should look for this, both for the initial sense of I and the resulting sense of mine, or the following sense of mine, as well as when we recognize a sense of mine, to trace it back to the sense of I. And this is something that exists in almost all circumstances. So, for example, when we are thinking about our loved ones, or those that we perhaps don't get on so with, there is our sense of I, and then this is expressed in how we relate to others through the sense of mine. Or when we're thinking about our hopes or our fears for the future, or reflecting on things that have happened in the past, there is the sense of I and mine, my hopes, my fears, things that happened to me that I disliked, that I like. So here again, when thinking about our hopes and fears to the future or to the past, or things that have occurred in the past, there's a sense of I and a sense of mine. And likewise in our work environment, when we have our hopes for a profitable endeavor, we have a thought of I, and from this the sense of mine, and then comes the various other thoughts, such as, in order to achieve my goal, I need to perhaps bend the truth here. I need to perhaps manipulate the circumstance. So here too, we can see the sense of I and mine acting out. And certainly, where we should look for this is in terms of our opinions, our views, because we have a sense of I, and from this comes my view, my opinion. And when others act in accordance with our wishes, or they agree with our views, we feel close to them. If they have a different opinion, or they disagree with what we want them to do, a frustration, an annoyance, maybe even looking down at them arises. And this all comes from our sense of I and the sense of mine. And right now, if we think of what are we doing? I am hearing a teaching. Why? I want to experience happiness. Whilst I'm hearing this teaching, I am reflecting on its meaning. So in all circumstances, we can be aware of this thought process, that where we see a thought arise, trace it back to how it comes from a sense of mine and a sense of I. And likewise, look for that sense of I and see what follows from this. And in this way, we can gain ever stronger familiarity with how the I appears to us.
And the Tongbani said the Toho, Rechizanta Tongbani Toho, when the Tongbani Toelia, some localistan Tohures, can this ever Chore says, down on the Diring on the Digor Mashu.
That then concludes the summary of what we looked at last week. So now tonight, I want to follow on from that and present how then one engages in the reflection on emptiness, how one comes to realize emptiness.
The Tongbani said the Toelia, Dambong was some diety, Dendregi or some Tango, that Tambo Dendre says some Tangos. Just a Dendre some diet, the Dendre de la Rignores, Yundigi Dendre said Jita. Didn't tape, Dendri said you were says, the Niki Dendri and Namshade Dampong as a Hako or Gitchmachawan. Gundigi Dendri said, didn't tape Dendri said in Yungureje.
To realize emptiness, then the best approach is to start by reflecting on the presentation of dependent arising. And dependent arising can be divided into two: dependency on causes and conditions, and mutual dependency.
I think the Dambo Gundigi says some time in that Gundigi Telea and Rapata Chamata Mamboyora, the name that I'm to Dambo Rapa sometime in Bendigo 7 Chigma, Tapche. Telia Nuki, but then as a Tongo, washing buzz, Tongan, she being buzz with my seven Tagore, then you would get, then you would get while then Yaya, then Della, then and the J woman body, and then Anzuki, and the Hakura, just a dinner and you will 7 ma tapche, magic tapche, then you would give a 7 Tagumeban, 7 the Tapmena, you would get a medican. That 7 day, you know, this a meteor, my dead Saku or 7 Yakisaka Saku, and the Delia and Chuku. 제가 되니게 사다 추다 되니게 죄고 되니 매나 아직 사번 마 샤바네 누구끼기 매바딩 가서 하고 두고 봐 진짜 되니 자자 누구끼에 장아서 뜬도리 신도리 기나랑 가서 사야 돼 뜬도리 가래 이면은 마당고 사번제 답 되니야 끼는 마도 사번제 답 규지 매발라 네 디끼기 매바딩 가서 세고 하고 두고 봐 디 균리기 때문에서 우라베니 제보디 규사번치라 때네 기고를 마도 제보디 규사번치라 마템바 제보디 와야 매바지로 대자 제보디 규사번들 땜바로 거의 땜바래 땜제서
As always, one starts to look at with examples that are very easy to understand, because when we get some skill then in the reflection, we can go to subtler illustrations. So looking at the first of the two types, that of dependency on causes and conditions. Take an illustration we're all familiar with from our own garden. In order to grow a particular plant, we know we need to plant that particular seed. And so in dependence on planting the seed, which acts as the cause, that seed will sprout and grow into the plant that we long for. And not only do we need that cause, namely the seed, but we also need particular ripening conditions. The soil, for example, needs to be the appropriate or the suitable soil for that type of plant, and the appropriate amount of warmth and moisture also needs to be applied for that particular seed to sprout into the plant that we desire. So that we can understand clearly. But the key point that is being made here is that in order to give rise to a particular result, that particular cause is required. And not only the cause, but the ripening conditions too. If the cause is lacking, the result will not come. If the ripening conditions are not there, the cause will not ripen into the result. And so from an illustration such as from our garden, or from knowing how farmers grow crops, we can understand the general principle quite easily.
And then 미치기 사번 균에 마다바체 사번 마덴비게 사번 마덴비게 신도지 요래 라바이나 저기 아니 변 구슈로지 사번 마덴비게 구슈지 요래 라바이나 당아서 균에 켈링 말바디 자 균에 말아 결혼다딘 결혼 너를 추월해서 마도 아주 균에 켈링 말아 가서 구슈세디 요바라 코 사번이 답되네 동보되네 메도샤 되네 지부기고 요바데 세부시 가서 하고 사와인자 구슈세 잡은 칭도라 마딘비게 되네게 마딘 먹고랑 그런 뭐네 끼디고 구슈주 요래랍나 자기는 요 말에서 생각 중에 킬링 버라 되네게 요래서 몇 삼로디다 로로히에 노주에 생각 중에 세부하고 두르와
If we meet someone holding an apple and they say, this apple did not come from an apple tree, we will not believe them. If they say this apple did not come from an apple tree, we will not believe them. Why? Because we know that apples come from apple trees. To have a result, a cause is required. So if someone says this apple just manifested here, just appeared, it arose causelessly, there was no cause for this apple, we will not believe them. In fact, we all know that their consciousness that believes that this apple that came about without the appropriate cause is a wrong consciousness.
배 야고지 참모된가서 하고 그거 말아. 네가 저 가브리엘한테 사번디 도도지 마답샤네 뉴마지 봐 용거로. 네가 용서 그런 게 도도지어디 이네 그런 게 사번 계획이 니버 참모디 여바디 가서 하고 마메 디나 매반자 기고 말아. 지나다 사번 마기네 기 니버 되는지 가려서 야 되네야 천직 비기 고다시 심지어 되는 니버지 여바 하고 안주기 다지 하고야 돼. 야 되스칼레 카르바. 지금 그런 규들에 균 니버 참모되게 여바디 되는지 띵거를 돼 가지고 하고도 말아. 근데 아직 그 추루발에 추들래야 안치 장모다 죄니가 찬용받지 국어로 와다 세지 국어마도 양지 장차나 기투고 말 차차나 기투고 말와 지산 찬용받지 국어로 와 지산 되네게다 찬용받간데 쉬고 체로 간데 국어에서는 안주야데 남사 하고야 할까 하도 와되네 지산 되네질 뛰고 왔대 되네게 뛰고 봐도 안주가 하고야 돼서 갈래 가요 그래서 또 참모갈 돼서 와다
The illustration then of needing to plant a particular seed to give rise to the plant that we desire, this we can all easily understand. But even that same illustration has subtle levels that some of us will not know at all. For example, someone who knows nothing about gardening, if they want to have a particular plant, they can then go and select that appropriate seed. So that level they will know. But they will not know what type of soil, how much water, how much heat is required. There they will just guess, or they'll need to do some research to look at that in more detail. Similarly, a more skilled gardener will know precisely that the particular plant that they wish to grow, they not only need to buy the right seed, but they will also have the knowledge, because they are skilled, to know how to care for that seed to ensure that its potency, its potential that it has to sprout is nurtured properly. So they will have that knowledge. But they may lack the knowledge to know exactly what happens at a molecular level for that seed, for the potential in that seed to lead to sprout. So they'll know the precise conditions, so they have a deeper level of knowledge, but there's still a level that is unknown to them. And that unknown level will be known to learned botanists. For them, they will know precisely what happens at a molecular level when the right conditions are there for that seed to sprout.
나 치용어 버를 되네. 당 알아서 강사 알아서 삼담배네. 지상 알아서 수부티에 아니 규단 kiến起来 되네. 기교바 등아서 세와하고 두고로 배네. 아말레 되네. 아말레 되네. 이거를 아말게 돼야 아니 규가르스네 파마니기 아니 지게 구다 뒤바 되네. 제절라 되네. 기교바데 내 되네 하고 걸어와. 제자 되네자 내서 되네기 알아서 가실래 알아서 미디기네 알아서 수부티기네 유단 kiến起来 되네 기구여바디 세부로 와다가서 하고 두고 그래. 안디 기회에는 다드누 야게 줘야디 세주다 칼라다 디네 사실 디네 주기 토네 니베기야 폐게 따지 야야 철세 조고바디 지산 현실의 규질의 되고여바디 가서 세부하고 두고 그래. 디네 인자당 저기 왕아 미게 되게 파말에 되고 말에 아니 저 규리기 규요 말에 규매발 미지기리랍나 수치 킬링이 말와다. 디네 자기는 요 말에 써야 돼. 그런 노고를 라그로 마동아서 규네 킬링 말하디 케밀레 바주스 가르슨 아주 미게야디 자산 규단 kiến了 되네. 对是규단 kiến起来 되네. 개와도 하고 두고 그래서 윤직이 된데 락바락바디게 하고 요도 하고 완전 저기 디네게 락바지래 규단 kiến了 마도바지 미지기게들라나 디 노트를 킬링 말와. 그래서 디가선 아주 규kiến了 되네. 개와 하고 완전 디 킬링 거 말. 응응이 수도 하고 완전.
A further illustration from the material world would relate to our body. So we know our body came about in dependence on causes and conditions, and these are widely known, that our body came about in dependence on a fertilized egg. And we also know that in order to be taken to full term, our mother needed to take care of us through eating and drinking. And likewise, once we were born, we needed to be cared for in a particular way in order to grow. So this is widely known. And if someone was to say, I came into this world without any cause. I wasn't born from parents. I just appeared. No one would believe them. They would say, well, if you believe that about yourself, that is a wrong consciousness. And we would be able to say that with certainty because we understand the situation in accordance with reality. We understand the birth process. And therefore, if someone makes an outlandish claim, claiming something that we know not to be in accordance with reality, we ourselves wouldn't be deceived and believe them, and we'd recognize that they were under the influence of a wrong consciousness.
언다는 뒤지기 최 다 참어이나 다 락바이나 다 뒤지 뭐고 뒤지기 최 간에 지 임베이네 다 되니기 코로나 소소라는 게 투모만 임베 코로나 계획이 규단建起了 되는 주바마도 규단 建起了 마도바다 가야매 말이다.
Those are two easy illustrations to understand, and we can apply that principle to all impermanent phenomena, all compounded phenomena, phenomena that have come about in dependence on causes and conditions. All impermanent phenomena are dependent on causes and conditions.
안데디 균제기 땡제게 삼단하 되네시 다 땡네 답에 땡제 균제 멤버 땡네 답에 땡제 세베는 당한 쪽에 베네 파초다 야솔만 파초가 리다 수쇼 리세디 디 리디 파초가 리세디 수쇼가 리델라 땡네 파초 차바리마도 수쇼가 리디메나 파초가 리라야요마 수쇼메나 파초 차차야메베 지나다 파초 데메바네 수쇼 차야메베 지나 파초다 수쇼 세디 파초 데라 땡네 수르기 쇼 쇼데 수저 될라 때네 파기 초세 샤고 진짜 되네 권이 지규진의 제부지 개와 말에 되네 따바래 或 되네 됐다바 가서 예다 윤세디 예 될라 되네 윤세시 민다고 말 예디면은 윤세 민다요 말에 진짜도 윤요 반자 윤될라 되네 예선 따고 말도 윤디면은 예세 따면 매반자 예다 윤세디 파다데 예세디 윤了 되네 되바래 마도 이 권이 윤제 말에 이나 되는 주바래 진짜 윤다 예를 되는 주 예다 윤다 진짜 파쇼 지사야 수쇼를 되는 주 수쇼세다 파쇼 되는 주 되는 아주 딱 봐서 지 동바래 샤세다 지면은 수전지를 되네 고 동바 매바 고마데 될 여바지 매나 동바스키 시험마다 동바지를 되네 수전디 동바 매바 여바서 수전세 주고 진짜 딱 봐서 되게 뒤실을 되네 딱바세고래 딱바라 되네 뒤시세고 거니 윤제 책을 때 편지 뚜릅치고래 진짜 되네 딱바세 되네 딱베 된제세고래 되네 딱베 된제 아 진짜 딱바세의 뒤질을 되네 딱바세샤고래 마도 뒤지면은 변 딱바라디 게디나 지혜메겐 되고래 레고로와 지혜메바 되고래서 지혜지 얘네 얘바지를 되네 고 되고래 신마도 지혜지면은 고 게디나 두거를 이렇게 샤요 말봐. 진짜 다 고지기 지기리에서 된 딱발을 뛰네 샤고. 진짜 디네서 권이 편전 뛰네 딱배기 된제 마도 아니 균지기 다 말해 됐어다.
That then was a couple of easy illustrations that are easy to understand to explain the first type of dependency, dependence on causes and conditions, and that relates to all impermanent phenomena, all compounded phenomena, compounded meaning coming together. Then the second type of dependency is that of mutual dependency. So here we can take an illustration of there being two mountains, and you'd say one mountain is over here, the second mountain is over there. So this relationship of mutual dependency here is being illustrated by here and there. You can only have something here in dependence on there being something there. So this is not a relationship of cause and effect, or there's not a dependency of cause and effect, but a mutual dependency. So to take the illustration then of two mountains, whilst the mountains themselves are impermanent phenomena and therefore dependent on causes and conditions, to be able to say one is over here and the second is over there is dependent, or is mutually dependent. So the concept of here and there is mutually dependent. Similarly, with left and right. We can only speak about left in dependence on speaking about right. We cannot speak about something being on the left if there is no mutual dependency on the right. Similarly, with emptiness, phenomena being empty is mutually dependent. It's mutually dependent on something lacking. So this is the case then with all permanent phenomena or uncompounded phenomena. they are also dependent arisings, but their relationship is one of mutual dependency. Whereas the previous illustrations were relating to impermanent phenomena, and they are dependent on causes and conditions.
The pene Matthew Bachi Yamere, Pen Tapa said in a chicle twene, Ngobochilla twene Yungore, says Tapa Ladu, Gedina Tapa Gedina, Hara, Yuagunima, Nigore, Selagorwa, says Gedina, Gedina, Yuagunim, Nigore, Laviodu, Shandaji, Juadu, you can see Yen Mato, Shen Laya Marwa, says Dinenza, Co Tapa said him, Ngobola Dujil, Twene, Shagore, Tapa Shagore. So that Duje said the Kiji Juadu, Giore, Laviodu. 파조 가야 미지겐지 균균의 유아 메디겐 다라네 되겐지 매바이나 뒤지디게가 유아 두고래 라비에 직라 메레 직 유아 두한 매바지 여나서 될라되네 안데 유아 두에 매바데 유아 두고래 세지 샤고르와 진짜 펜춘 되네 되루브래 진짜 되네 디수 되네 뒤지에 따바디게 뒤실에 되네 두고 유 샤고래 뒤지에 매나 딱바세 샤야라고 말해 진짜 뒤지디게 딱발로 되네 뒤시 샤고래 대자 딱발면은 뒤시 샤야 말 진짜 인den사 진이가 편주 뚜루르마도 건조 띠네 답이 띵절 띵 찍찍실래 띠네 파 뢰파 답이 띵절에마도 찍찍의 유긴진의 유단 대부진의 줍두가 말해서 그래서 띠네게
All phenomena that exists, everything that exists, whether it's something in the external world or something in the inner world, any kind of consciousness, for example, everything that exists can be classified as either permanent or impermanent. If it's impermanent, it means it changes momentarily. And if it changes momentarily, whether we can observe it or not, if it's impermanent, it will be changing momentarily. And it will have come about in dependence on causes and conditions. So all impermanent phenomena not only change momentarily, but they come about in dependence on causes and conditions. Permanent phenomena do not change momentarily, but they are still dependent arisings. They are mutually dependent. So to give another illustration of permanent phenomena that are mutually dependent, the concept of permanent and impermanent, this too is mutually dependent. One can only talk about impermanence if there is also permanence. There is a relationship between these two concepts of mutual dependency.
나도 전에 삼텐제 삼다이도 제가 텐데들 규라 텐데 준비 제보세야 규세디 제보세디 규라 텐데 좀 띵거래 제가 규세 텐데 좀 거. 제가 텐데서 균지게 텐데. 다 균지게 맨나야 양지 텐데 답에 텐데서 다 여바 간데 신이 야나 텐데 답에 텐데 차 야나 균지게 텐데 차로 되네. 다 텐데게 찍찍래 떼바마도 찍찍래 맞된 바디 가메야 차로다. 뭐 뒤지게 최나 현실을 떼네 용구마도 현실을 맞되어 뒤지민도 나 뒤마지게 저 딱바로 치네 현실을 랑래 현실을 떼네 샤는마도 랑 현실을 맞되어 봐 샤기네 매딩에 책으로 와서 제가다 여바간에 딱바 있나다 뭐 있나다 현실을 맞되어 봐 이니 매딩에 저 대된제 사지고 와대.
Therefore everything, all phenomena that exists are either impermanent and changing momentarily, or permanent and unchanging. Those which are impermanent and changing momentarily are dependent arisings. They are dependent on causes and conditions. And another way that this can be expressed is all results are dependent on causes. So that's the first type of dependency, that is dependent on causes. So everything that's a result has come about in dependence on causes. Then the second type of dependency relates to the other class of phenomena, those which are permanent or unchanging. So these are all mutually dependent, or dependent on something other. So all permanent phenomena, those that do not change momentarily, are dependent on something or mutually dependent, such as the concept of impermanence and permanence, such as here and there, left and right. This, then, in brief, is a presentation on dependent arising. As well as one comes to know this, or the better that one comes to know this, the better the chances are of one coming to gain a good understanding of emptiness, a transformative understanding of emptiness. So this is the understanding dependent arising, is the very best method to come to realize emptiness. So let's then, now having taken that presentation on dependent arising, let's look at then how to meditate on emptiness. The meditation on emptiness has as its first step coming to recognize or identify self-grasping. Self-grasping being the root cause of all afflictions. So the first step in the meditation is to recognize or identify this consciousness, this ignorance of self-grasping. So again, let's just quoted two lines from Shantideva's Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I had to look it up. Without identifying the object to be investigated, its non-existence cannot be apprehended. This verse is also to be found in our text from the weekend teachings, entry into the key to the middle way. So looking at the verse again, or the two lines again, without identifying the object to be investigated, its non-existence cannot be apprehended. The object to be investigated here then is self-grasping. So if one cannot identify this, one will not be able to recognize that it doesn't exist. So if one doesn't identify the object to be investigated, and the object to be investigated is the object of negation, which is true existence. So if one doesn't identify true existence, one will not be able to recognize that it is empty that one will not be able to realize its emptiness.
당한 저기 가자 뭐 소야래야 당보도 시삼단 소소한 나 세지어와 당한 도 신도 나 세삼단 소스도 삼다데 나 세삼단 요도 되가블야 나디 안 줄로로야 셔도 갑라 간데치 철도 스파 심지죠 당보 나 세삼단 지상 나 세삼단도 나디 로로야 철도 간데치 주부지로 철도 스비도 심지제도 다바이나 다요도 갑라 안 알아주기 nga sedi nga zo lo le cha de nga zu gu zu bu da ka ya ma yin ba korong an ji lo su an de ngwe ne zhu ti ge ye ba zhu xin de ni xin neng guo da zu le ga la ye ma de ba xie lue pa da ba le ma de ba pong bo da pong bo ran nga zu pong bo le ngo ta de bi ge lo su ji ye ba de ni ji nga zu lo le neng guo le nga se na ta de lo le na de neng guo le.
The first step of the meditation is to come to see how the self appears to our mind. And the way that it appears is as if it has the characteristic of being independent. So before we looked at dependent arising, and there are those two types of dependency. But the way the self appears to us is not as dependent, but rather as independent. Independent of the body. So not relying on the body, not being influenced by the body. Also, the self appears to be independent of mind at all. It appears not to be influenced by mind, something separate from that. And also, thirdly, the self appears as if it doesn't require imputation at all. So this is how the self naturally or spontaneously appears to our mind, as being independent.
지사 당봉한 저기 돈이 제바치디가 또 소소가 세로리아가 세삼다 디네서도 삼다데 로레 소수로리아가 세 간지 체기도 세비게야 심주지디 야고 삼다제데 로리아가 세데 차상데 디네치 체기도 세베 세부지 하고 고야디 예침부 체기스로 당보 디네치 하고 고이스로.
This first step of the meditation is of paramount importance. So here, this is where we need to spend time to try and see for ourselves how our sense of self appears to us. So I've described it, but we need to come to recognize this for ourselves, not merely just know the words, it appears as if it's independent of body and mind and anything at all, but come to recognize this for ourselves.
nga se di phungbo le lo so ngo cha de ba an shen lue pa da ba la ma de ba ko rong wen ni zhu de ba neng go re se di na neng go ba de ha go ba de neng go re se di na wa na shin da ga ra yo re sam bi jing di na wa na shin da ga ra yo re se bi sam lo sho ro ba de le din jin la ko da din jin ma ri pa se de gansa da du zhu ba jin ba da jin le di la ge re gansa din jin se di le ko de ni shi lo de le ming gansa din jin se na gansa da jin se de le ko da.
So the first step then of this meditation is to come to recognize for ourselves how the self appears, which is as being independent of anything at all, independent of the body, independent of the mind. Then this is how the self spontaneously or naturally appears to us, and a consciousness grasps at the self as existing in this way, and that is a consciousness of either, it can be called either self-grasping or true grasping, grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, or it apprehends. If you prefer to grasping, you can say it apprehends the self as existing in the way that it appears, existing independently.
ane gansa tenpa zhuba zhube tenzins, anzi gansa tsenyu zhuba zimbe zimba, gansa rangshin yu zhuba zimbe zimba, senede kwa ming kaka dagor de ina duanda dire gansa se nga zulpa, gangla nang yu duka lola nang duka gangla ya ma de pungbo dang ngo tate ba, tanyi lue pa sha pa la ma de ba, rang ngwe ni zhub duba yue ba di nang wa na sin daga na yore senbe zimba dire, 데네기 짐바데레 밍 가브렐라 가사 다센스 밍 베지탄가 가브렐라 가사 템버투바즈베 딘짐 세다 안데 가사 라싱 투바즈베 짐바세다 가사 칭이 투바즈베 짐바세다 밍 두소 용거 데네 돈다 로디치크레 딘지불.
This presentation I'm giving is in accordance with the highest of philosophical views, the Prasangika. Here they use several synonyms. They're synonymous, the meaning is the same, but it's good to be aware that sometimes different terms are used, but the meaning for the Prasangikas is the same. So in brief, the meaning is the self appears as if it's independent. And then the consciousness that grasps at it is referred to by synonyms. True grasping, true grasping, or self-grasping, or grasping at the self as existing by way of its own characteristics, or grasping at the self as being inherently existent, grasping at the self as being naturally existent, grasping at the self as being existent by its own essence, grasping at the self as existing truly. So all of these are synonymous for Prasangika. True grasping, or grasping at the self as existing truly, inherently, naturally, or by way of its own characteristics.
풍보래 오신 뢰파 따발라 떼바 많이 바랑군이 두바 나와나 다가다 요래 선배 진바디 끼에제 되네 진바디 원게다 니세디 샤드레다 좀 니자라 니녀사다 되네 디제네 차가델야 차과게 뭐 지게 차과게다 콘트게다 되네 요하디 되네게 다신 델라트네 용고래 시사디 다신 마릭 바세 되지가서 자위 뇨모바 차산 자위 뇨모바게 자와디레 사시에 디레다데.
Just to tie this in with what we looked at earlier and last week in terms of the quotation from Chandakirti. So the self appears to us as being independent, meaning it's not influenced or it's not influenced by the body or the mind, or doesn't require the body or mind. The body or mind doesn't have an impact on it, and no imputation by mind is required for the self. It appears to us as being independent. So this is how the self appears. From this comes the sense of mind. So this is what we referred to earlier tonight and last week, the quotation of Chandakirti. Well, from the sense of mind arises, from the self and the sense of mind, the I and mine, come all our afflictions, our wants, our desires, our friends, our enemies. And this is the root cause, the self-grasping, grasping at the self as existing in a way that it actually does not exist, grasping at the self as existing truly or independently or naturally. This is the root cause of all our suffering. It's the root cause that leads to all the other afflictions coming and the accumulation of contaminated karma.
풍보라 마디오바 아니 뢰파 따발 탱이 뢰파 따발 마랑문이 두바 나와나 신딩하디 다 가와도 신나가 심주셔야래다 다 대지 데네게 하디 나와나 신하디 다 알아주기 풍부에 다 예나 알아주기 수부에 때는 예나 마도 신 치료를 왜서요 말봐 치료요 매매 말봐 다다 예나 아주 디나요 걸봐 다도 신의 심주지에 갑라 다 대지 다 아주 내 풍보들 레벨하네 다 풍보대 말해. 가르스는 풍보대 풍보 속이 풍보셔야 돼. 샤다 차다 루고다 망보지 규단 기에 망보를 떼는 주바지래. 그 강나 마디오 바지 말와 대신 아주 떼내 삼다와나 신 아주 풍보디 규단 기 망보지를 떼는 주바래. 제가 다데 나와나 신가디 풍보디 임바 있나? 아니 가르스는 나와나 신가디 가르는 것은 강나에 마디오 봐. 그런 원이 줍도 괜찮지 능도 나와지. 제가 데니게 나디 강나에 마디오 봐 풍보디 간래 마도 바레면 가서 풍보디 규단기에 망보실에 되는 주바 되는자 풍보디 아니 나디 레면도 와스 도스치는 나디 많이 받을 세바하고도 그러 대신 아주 풍보디 된지게 남자 삼다와서 제가 풍보서 규단기에 초바 망보 되는 주바한자 제가 나와나지 나디 간래 마도 받지 하고더니 가다르샤 가와르샤 제가디 이 풍보디야 나디 레면도 선배 삼리거래
The first step of the meditation was to see how the self appears to us. Now we come to the second step of the meditation, which is the investigation to see whether the self exists in the way that it appears to us or not, whether it exists independently, whether it exists independent of influence by anything at all, such as the physical aggregate, the body, or mental aggregates. So this is now the second step of the meditation. And this we can divide into an A and a B, because we are now going to embark in the second step on the investigation to see whether the self exists in the way that it appears as independent. And this investigation can only be done here with our aggregates, with our body and mind, not out there in the forest or in another place in the world. Our self doesn't exist away from the aggregates. It has to be found, if it's going to be found, it has to be found here with our body and mind. So in this meditation then, the A part, 2A, is the investigation into the body. The self then, we've come to recognize, appears as if it's independent. So is the body that independent self? And we can search throughout the various parts of the body, and it's very clear. The body comes about in dependence on causes. It's not independent, it's dependent. It's an impermanent phenomenon that changes momentarily, and therefore it's a dependent arising, dependence on causes and conditions. So the self that appears to be independent cannot be found in the body, because the body is so clearly dependent on causes and conditions.
Nan subi tendo subu dinye subi tendo nga se na wana je nga kangla ye ma de rang mo nyu zube nga de subi tendo nye me ba de je sa de me ba de me na ta na sem tendo na sem tendo du es ta subi tendo mi du ta na da nga chala ma son de le me na an pa cho dil du ze oro din ha da subi tendo nye mi du de ne ge nga de nye mi du je da nye me da na sem tendo ka ho tu che ba na da ji ba ro wa da sem de ne pe ne cho ye sem na la de phung bo 초유 풍보 두시 넘버시 풍보하셔야 풍보 가요. 이내다 지산 시바 찍바로. 제사에나 초와다 두시에다 두시 넘버시 시바 가르시나 대지 시바 나진 대징아도 된지 주와서야 돼. 시바 가는 두시에서 그런 거 규단建起来的줍대요. 지산 시바서도 그런 기징아마다 치마들 되는 저 개정 치마들 기징아마들 되는 줍 아마들에게 나게 치마치와 마루고로 그래서 되네서 셰바세의 규단建起来되는 줍 현실을 뛰고도 마티오바 강라 마티오 라왕도 요바도 재미도 왔어. 지산 셰바 된자는 나래 나야 돼 가는 곳은 나와나지 나지 강라에 마티오바 뢰파 샤발라 마티오 그런 원이 줍되겠지 난도스 디나신 나와디 셰바 재미도 셰바디 가서 규단 기징아마를 뛰어야 되는 주 tuyển trục tuyển mà trục tuyển rễ sa, thế nên ra xí bê tiền đấy ngã đi, thế nên càng làm mà tôi răng ngôn trục tuyển ngã sẽ xí bê tiền lại mình ta, nhị mình
Searching then for this independent self can only be done here with our body and mind, not elsewhere. So the first step then in the first part, the 2A in this meditation, was to seek the independent self within the body, and we find the body. Because it is dependent on causes, no independent self can be found within the body. So if not in the body, where else can the self be but in the mind, internal consciousnesses? It's the only other place. So that's the second part of point 2. So here 2B is to investigate the mind or consciousness. Here then we can look, divide mind or consciousness in any number of ways, whether into feeling, discrimination, or general consciousness, or any other way that one chooses to divide consciousness. And one will not find any consciousness that is the independent self. Why? Because consciousness, whichever consciousness one looks at, none of them are independent, but are rather dependent. Consciousness clearly changes momentarily. It is therefore impermanent, and being an impermanent phenomenon, as we heard earlier, it is dependent on causes and conditions. Consciousness changes continuously. But we have the sense of self, feeling can change, we know this. So no feeling can be our sense of self, this independent, unchanging sense of self, because consciousness such as feeling so clearly changes. So therefore here, just like when investigating the body, when we investigate consciousness, we see that there is no independent self to be found within consciousness, because all our consciousnesses are clearly dependent, not independent. Dependent on causes, and they change momentarily. So therefore an unchanging independent self cannot be found amongst our consciousnesses either, for the same reason as we couldn't find an independent self within our body. The first part of the meditation, we recognize how the self appears to us as being independent, and then we search for it. And the only place to search is here within our aggregates. And we first look for it in the body, and we can't find this independent self within our body, because our body is not independent, but rather dependent. So no independent self can be found within a dependent body. Similarly, when we go to be in the meditation, we do the same analysis, but within our mind or consciousness. And for the same reason, we cannot find an independent self within consciousness, because consciousness so clearly is dependent, changes momentarily, independence on causes. And because it changes momentarily, independence on causes, no consciousness can be the self, an independent self. So that is the meditation thus far, and it brings us to the point where we can't find the self. We've looked for the self to see if it exists in the way that it appears. We recognize it can't be elsewhere in the world, it has to be here. We can't find this self that is independent, despite it appearing so. Can't find it in the body, and we can't find it in the mind. Therefore, such a self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And this is where one comes to realize emptiness. One realizes that the self is empty of existing truly, or the self is empty of existing inherently or naturally, or empty of existing by way of its own defining characteristics. And here one comes to realize emptiness.
Andu chine ma sam tandu chen sam tang chi cheba che chodu an gansam chilya o de ka nga se de mindu sembege samlo chi de nga se de mindu sembege cheda chungye cheda Cheda nga mindu sembi cheda lege ani nga chi yungore jiza dini za da dini ge du chin jeba chi de da dina ji nga na xin nga se jeba chi de nga de kang la ya ma de rang ngwe ne zhup de ge da na wa na xin nga zao ge ni mindu a sembi ge sambi ge samno ji ba ji je de dong sang la chi le de dini 민두 sembe dine yang chi paradilia oda nga mindu a sembe da nga mena ana garchi oreda nga nen 최제의 파도스 가면 하면도 왔으나 나면은 나 타버 톱스 나 산요고 왕 톱 되네 나 디기 구세 라면도 진짜 괜찮아 가르나선 베기다 되니게 토네 안에 지게 야 델리아 지게 이게 시나로 레야 시나로 장암로 레야 나 되니게 용 시기리스도 와 되니게 콜람레야 보마 유데
Where then I've presented thus far is the correct way to engage in the meditation. However, at this point, so after the 2A and the 2B, when one recognizes that the self does not exist in the way that it appears to us, it does not exist in the way that we believed it to so since beginningless time, there is a grave danger of falling into the extreme of nihilism. Because we've come to recognize that the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears, and then we may think the self doesn't exist at all, and this is a view of nihilism. And why this is so dangerous is one will think, if the self doesn't exist at all, there is no self to experience the ripening results of karma. There's no self, therefore, that can attain liberation. There's no self that can attain enlightenment. Therefore, there's no point in training in the Buddha Dharma. And at this point, if it's quite possible that a sense of unease or even a sense of fear may arise within oneself, thinking that one doesn't exist at all.
And that was Jeva Chejiang Zunga said, Susugulo, Nawa Nashin, Chela Matuba, Rangun, Truptuba, Nawa Nashin, Jeva Chede, Rangi Pumbo, and the Choi Pumbo, Pumbonga Sugi Pumbo, Choi Pumbo, Dushi, number she Pumbo, Pumbong, and the Gangi, then a Yeme, Dongsan, Domba, Dongodu, then it Dongbani, that didn't do Dongbani, Dongsan, or Tonsan, that day, Yanga Dicelia, and then I do your Maribe said some time down your Ducapla, Nadi Yores, Canis Yore Lamna, Takari Yorsen, Pumbong Abu Country, Palu, Tabatsam Yores, Tabatsam, Pumbong, said. Dalai Matuba Rangun Dubadim Nawana Shinti Yomares, Takanis Yoresen, Shenchi Pumbong about Country Duje, Delapa Lu Tabatsam Yobares, she's not Tabatsam Yores or Nadi.
So here then in the meditation we've gone through points 1, 2A and 2B, and we've come to recognize firstly how the self appears. And then we've investigated within the body, and we've seen that no such self can be found there. And we've investigated in the mental aggregates and come to see that no independent, unchanging self can be found anywhere within consciousness either. Rather, the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. So that's how far we've come. And now we come to the fourth step of the meditation. And this is where one... So as to guard against that potential danger of falling into the extreme of nihilism, one here in the fourth step reminds oneself of how the I or the self does exist. And the way that the self does exist is as a dependent arising, dependent on imputation by mind, or to express this differently, dependent on designation by mind, or a third way it's expressed, dependent on labeling by mind. So therefore, the self or the I exists as a mere imputation by mind, and therefore is a dependent arising. But it does not exist in the way that it appears, but is rather merely labeled by mind.
Mingyang Dao Zem Nga say or Mingyang Mi Lupa Daba Zamji, Shenji Lupa Mingpa, Ming Daba Zem Nga did, Naris or Nga said.
This is the unique view of the Prasangika. So, in answer to how does the self exist, they say it exists merely as dependent on imputation by mind. Or, here we'll use the three synonyms, merely dependent on designation by mind. Or thirdly, merely dependent on labeling by mind. So those are three synonymous ways that Prasankika presents how the self exists. Doesn't exist independently, but dependently. How? Merely in dependence on labeling by mind.
아주 풍봉어버 강로질 팔뢰 따바신 풍봉 나세 풍봉어버디 나 말에디 이네 풍봉어버디 풍어버질이야 안 뢰파 따바 점이 나세 뢰 따바 점이 요바레스 요레스 나디 간스 요레스는 풍봉어버질레 뇌세 뢰파 따바지 따네 요바레스 지금 나 무인에서 나디 되는 요레스래 당한 저기 셈이 진투 가르친 것은 나된 뢰는 나에도 나세야데 강라에 마되바 강라야 마디고 풍보래 마디고 랑 지 뢰 파다발로 랑문에 주바 나시 디나와 나신 진고레스 지다 디나와 나신 진바디 나고이니스다 미튼 바샤 나고랑문에 예대 간다 요래라네 풍봉가 바 강로실 페로 따니 요바레스 현실 뇌제 풍보 뢰 파다니 요바레 다디 뢰 현실 풍봉가 볼레 뇌제 뢰 따니 요바디레 도초 나한테 진야디기 나진디기 마데바 뢰 따발레 마데바 코랑원에 두바 진데 제가 무인이 수딜레 요바딜레 독쇼 진데 제가 고 로로해 차데레 제
Here then, at the conclusion of the meditation, where we've gone through these 4 steps, we've come to recognize how the self both does not exist as well as how it does exist. We've come to recognize that the self exists merely as an imputation by mind, merely labeled by mind. The self does not exist in the way that it appears to us and is grasped at as being independent of one's body, independence of one's mind, independence of anything at all. So we grasp at the self naturally or spontaneously as if it exists independent of anything at all, but we've come to recognize that this is not how the self exists in reality. It's empty of existing in this way. It's empty of existing truly or inherently or naturally. It's empty of existing in this way. Rather, it's exists as a mere imputation by mind, or merely labeled or designated by mind. Here then, at the conclusion of the meditation, we've come to recognize with wisdom how the self does exist in reality. And with this knowledge, we recognize that the general way, the spontaneous way that we grasp at the self as existing, in other words, as being independent, that is an ignorance. And it's an ignorance because it is not in accordance with reality. It's contrary to reality. Now we've realized how the self does exist in accordance, in reality, and this consciousness then is in accordance with reality and therefore is a wisdom.
랑용원이 갈래 모두가 랑원들 나와체 디나와나 진디고래 진짜 디 마토 하고 마토바 디코 노트이 하고 마토바래 진짜도 제바체제도 제바제 가디 되지 나와나 두에 민도 제바도 제바체도 부봉이 되나 가야 되는 예매도 미도 되니기 매바도 동사데 차 되니게 당하디 간스도스는 부봉가 봐 간도지 뢰파 따바점이 요바디 세부 하고요도 되네 대시로데 록셰 임바다 다디 하고데 디로데리 안다 괜통 로디 안다 뇽모게 귀임바다 하고데 당아주게 동반이 또바데 덴지 제와 중에 또 로니디 고미야 누바체르데 대시게 가나주게 다도 주바지미 짐바데다 누바 총총조 주고르바 대마 총주르데 가서 뇽모바 되자 코로 뇽모바 나게세디 게메한 차주고르바 되네 자고 그 매바서 되네 가지고 디 매바서 와이나 매바 소요도 아주 탈바세 토야 딜리고로 와다 리고레제레
the way I've presented now, how the self does exist in reality as merely imputed onto the aggregates, labeled or designated onto the aggregates, is how the self exists in reality, but this is not how we engage with the self. We engage with the self as if it exists truly or independently. So we don't yet spontaneously recognize how the self actually exists in reality. We are therefore under the constant influence of ignorance, a mind that is contrary to reality. Hence, we suffer. Hence, our afflictions keep arising. However, the more we engage in this meditation, coming to the same conclusion, becoming ever more skilled in the varying steps, recognizing how the self appears as being independent, recognizing or coming to see that we cannot find such a self in our body or in our mind. And fourthly, that the self rather is just imputed onto our body, onto our various consciousnesses. As we become more familiar with this consciousness of wisdom, our consciousness of ignorance that is contrary to reality, this starts slowly to weaken. As our wisdom gains in strength, proportionately, our ignorance weakens. And to the extent that we weaken our ignorance, the afflictions that arise from this ignorance, from this grasping at the I and the resulting sense of mine, as this weakens, so too weaken the afflictions that follow from this. Afflictions such as anger, attachment, pride, and jealousy all weaken. And as our wisdom grows and our ignorance weakens, our attainment of liberation, the complete destruction of this ignorance, grows ever closer.
근데 따바쯤 유엔에 빼는 간세람도 빼는 가서 라과라고 삼다වෙ나 당아서 수기 풍보라 tinda 따바쯤이 nga세 유디 아주 따바 가브리엘 수기 풍보라 따네 nga스 가브리엘 초의 풍보 가브리엘 두시 풍보 가브리엘 남시 풍보 되니게 따네 시거로와 된자 당아서 수기 풍보라 따베 nga세지 가르요레스 간스 따기도 아주 로이 간스 따기도 sen 제바이나 당아서 가르섬도 sen 아주 수보디 nga 레베스나 nga 마르와 nge 수보를 라기로와 이내 아주 수보를 나제 땅에 수보를 나요도 갈라 nga 삼나 가서도스나 nga 나기도 라기로와 nga 나기도 섬거다 나야도 수보 나디요래 이내 nga 나기도 섬거래 지상 nga 저기 디캅라야 nga 나기도 라면도 수보데 나와 나요도 nga 나기도 섬도 수보들에 nga 사들로이 파다고르다데 다고 nga 나기도 라고 지상 나야기 시대다 나니 찍바 삼당도 거로와 찍바 따고로 삼당 거로와 진짜 나 나기도 세고 진짜데 진짜 니네장 나도 수부들랑 세 뢰파 바래 진짜 나 나기도 근데 도시게 진짜 수부들 발뢰 바다다데 된다기 여러봐 니네게 진짜다 수부기 나제데 파다선 나 라서라고라 나 나제 라서라고와 진짜 니네자 니네게 삼다데 나도 수부 나이데 나 나기도 라요데 진짜 나 세야데 수불 팔뢰 바 따제 따바점 위에 받으 따바점나 뢰 따타데 rak바로 삼다데 딘데 책으로와
Let's then take some illustrations that are easy to understand to show how we do impute ourself sometimes onto our body, sometimes onto our various consciousnesses, whether feelings or other consciousnesses. So to take an illustration of our body, we can readily recognize, as has been presented earlier, that our I is not our body, that this body is not who we are. It is not the sense of independent self that we have, is not this body which changes momentarily. But nevertheless, though, when we are physically ill, we say, I am sick. And what we are doing when we're saying, I am sick, is we are imputing our sense of I onto this body. And we are taking this basis of illness, our body, and we're seeing it as indivisible from our I. here we see how strongly we identify with this body that is suffering, this body that is ill, and we are seeing that we are ill, especially if we are very ill. How our sense of self and our body are so entwined. Whereas when we look, we see that we really are only imputing the self on the body. But that is not how it spontaneously appears to us without investigation.
Paso Maroche to see the dead Vena, Nade de Yelagora, Nade, Cousin Supudi de Yeva, Kuyomata Tigora, Desanga de Yelagra. Tangazo Paso Combaja to the Angadu Yelagora. Chisadi Supudi Kuyota, and Supudi Drugi and Adrumela rather than near Supudu said, Angadrumi as a Lia Merwa. Chisadan near Supudi de Angadu Lia Merwa. Chisada Supudi de Devadilla, Tara and Yedibadilla, Nade de Yes. Tada Subudi Pa Lang Guyota, Company Pa, Pue Todicala, Nadu Legora. And the negative to Sinanzuki, Pa Sul Pa, Lue Pat, Na said Pa, Dasha, Taba Samji, Tangazu, Jova, Juve, Java, Debe Java, Chasa, Tangazu, Java Chasa Chigo Rege, Sugi Pumpola Pa, Lue Pa, Legi, Subu Pumpola, Na, Sepa Taj, Taba Samji, Yavache, the negative Taba Samji, Sugi, Nanzuki. Nei joy, Java, and Debe Java, and Java Chigores.
Similarly, when I ask the question, what are you doing? Immediately the thought comes, I am sitting. And later, as you're standing up, the thought will come, I am standing, then I am walking. And if you're sitting really still, you'll think, I am sitting still. Or if one's fidgeting, then I'm fidgeting. This is how we naturally think about ourselves. We don't say, oh, this body is sitting, this body that I impute as mine is sitting, or this body that I impute as mine is now walking to the car. This is not how we talk, and it's not how we spontaneously think. But it is because of not recognizing how we relate to our body that all the resulting thoughts come. All the activities we engage in so as to fulfill the desires of this body or to avoid circumstances of this body, or the activities we engage in so as to fulfill our body's needs or to protect the body that we identify as ourselves, to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves warm, etc. So this is how we spontaneously relate to our body and impute ourselves onto the body.
Dusine, Dine Chinanga Chinga said Dambo Lolia Chaya de Gane Chagdu Chesamta, Dambo Tindig Namja Samtadi, Tishi Chebanashin, Zugi, Dambo Tinte Rapa, Zugi, Savenda, Dismadu Samta, sometimes Susu Pa Samta, Dine Chinan Susugi, Semna Chasata, Dine Chasan, Yuda, Yen Shangel, Dune Tuba Rigua, Sabiki, the Nigi Tien Shangel, Dune Tuba, Stable, how go you do, how go ache. Dene Andi Chela, and that said now you do, Lolia can Nangudu says some tadi, Lolia Nantadi, Yapo so much. Now you do that, Galaya Matupa, Pumbotan, Lupa Shalon Rangun to Bachi, Nangore. That did now and I shinting I did that. The nigga now and I sing I Kawatu, Stangi Subunana, Subudi Rebe, Sem de Rebe, and the same Nanda Sui Pumbotan to sheep, but number of Pumbo, then the Rebes and Budu, Shimju, Chebachi, and the Kabla. That is in the Tinti, Pumboti, Tinti, and Namja, some towns, Chisa Pumboti, Guda, Jen, like Dune Juba, Chiredua, Tinzada, now I see the Kala, Matuba Rangon Juba, Dini Kawa check to Chisada, Nasiadi, now I see Nadi, we Pumboti and Yamido, and the Simgit and Yamido, Kangit and Yamido, do Cheba, some Chebachi Kablada, Kansam Jema. And to do that, and to chair the Rapash Chagrava, to some tangy margin, and that by Chebachi say, Chebachi su tilea, su tata dugure, and they are sim nale, sim tata dugure, to Chima, Chebachi, the Niji, su tamota, sim tamota, digalma, Chebachi, Kansam Chiglia, 다 되네 나와 나신가 되네 제도 어떤 가셔야 자위는 민도 선배게다 동상 지난바지 리투긴 서와다 리긴 서와 되네게 동상 지난바 타 주비게 되네 동상 남바 리도 또 하고요도 될래야 돈이 또 바래서 되네 동상 지도 안 될래야 도진 민도 선배 동상 지네네 니지야 다는 안지 되네게 딱신 집에 찾는 나와 아직 가디 예는 민도但俺的其他有的，还是有的是，可能有的是怎么样些什么当然搞不了，俺的碰碰我不刚才去怕乱大把怎么有的都是的，他乱大把怎么都嘛多，乱大把嘛一把让人的主把的民都是，他乱大把怎么都是的，这好土的，其实他的那个好过吧，那他东北你在电这个南下的，那谁不是好过土的，的那好过样的，但是俺让人的主把真把的，大是牛毛把一把的地。다 디레샤 다 델레트는 녀모 바기기도스 다 디바자마 지다가서 디동마도베 로다 딘디도베 삼도디 야 야네 양도 삼도 니바 철셔 땅데 되는가서 그새 신의 셰바나신 신의 다 델레미베다 동반이 하고 처외절라 동반이 델레미네 띵에서 신의 줍대 셈데 니바 철다 신의 줍 다 되는 신의 딩안에 라동도 도시야 니바 철셔 다도 되는 녀모 바디바 바 총총을 바 방투고래서 다 방타로 되는 용고래서 당아들이 락바락바로 시래 되는지 마 하는 삼다하로 도시는 당하로 시대 디링 네스티네시 다 되는 도시는 아주나 소소라 삼다로 와다 지다 된지게 나 삼다 나서 나도 가는 난구도 세베 나와 나진 가래 차고 도수 삼다에 당아주 동반이 삼다다가 락바락바로 시대네시
Then tonight I've presented how to meditate on emptiness. And the illustrations I've given, I believe, are really straightforward and easy to understand. Taking these illustrations, then, use the same ones in your meditation, because the purpose is to gain familiarity with how to do this meditation. And then, through engaging in this meditation repeatedly over a sustained period, quickly you will progress past these very easy to understand illustrations. For example, that impermanent phenomena are dependent on causes and conditions. For example, the desired plant, the result, comes about in dependence on a specific seed and its conditions. This is easy to understand. But then we take it to a deeper level, applying it to selflessness. Similarly, looking at, I spoke about earlier about looking at for the self in the body, as well as looking for the self in the mind. Here, you can engage in this reflection in your daily meditation, but also in your daily activities. Look for when you're identifying with your body. When you're identifying with your body, such as in pain or how you look, and then to ask yourself, that characteristic that I'm identifying with in my body, is that really me? And even if one's engaging one's daily activities, in dependence on having trained well in meditation sessions, one will be able to recognize that we are merely imputing ourselves onto the body, that we are not this body. Similarly, when we are identifying ourselves with a particular consciousness, recognize that, be aware of that, then ask ourselves, am I identifying myself with this particular consciousness? Maybe a feeling of happiness or a feeling of frustration or pride. I'm identifying myself as being this. Am I that person? Is that consciousness me? And if we've been engaging in these meditations on a regular basis, we'll readily recognize that consciousness has come about in dependence on causes. It is not me. I am not that consciousness. And thereby, we start to weaken our identifying with individual consciousnesses. So we should engage in the meditation, or I encourage you to engage in this meditation as I presented here tonight, and do it on a regular basis, and then do so during the day as well. We'll come to see that this I that appears as being independent It can't be found, not in any particular consciousness or the collection of all our consciousnesses, nor in any individual part of the body or the body as a whole. And doing so repeatedly over a sustained period, both in and out of meditation, we'll gain ever more certainty that the self that appears as being independent and unchanging cannot be found in our body or consciousness, and it therefore doesn't exist in the way that it appears. And as we do this in both meditation and wherever we are and whatever we are doing, we'll be strengthening our familiarity with the wisdom that recognizes the self does not exist in the way that it appears. It's empty of existing in the way that it appears, but rather we are imputing it onto our body, onto our mind. And this then starts to weaken our self-grasping and thereby the resulting afflictions. And just like with the other topics of meditation, such as what we looked at previously with calm abiding, through engaging in the meditation repeatedly over a sustained period, one gains stronger familiarity with it. So by engaging in a meditation of calm abiding, strengthening our stabilization, which will eventually become the mind of calm abiding, so too, by engaging in this meditation, cultivating wisdom, we deepen our understanding. And in fact, these two meditations can be done together. When one meditates, looking for the self, recognizing it cannot be found, realizing it's empty of existing in the way that it appears, abide with that. Place one's mind on that realization. And in this way, one can develop the two together. And then lastly, when we go into the fourth step of the meditation, recognizing the mind, the self, is merely labeled onto the aggregates. So in this way, one can do both placement and analytical meditation together. We'll conclude there for tonight. So this then concludes of the three divisions of the perfection of wisdom. It concludes the first, the wisdom that knows the ultimate. And next week we'll start to look at the second two divisions, the wisdom that knows the conventional and the wisdom that knows how to accomplish the welfare of sentient beings.